It's August 27th, 2020. This is Roqe. Part 2 of our series looking back at the Pahlavi Dynasty and the seeds of the Islamic Revolution on this 40th anniversary summer of the death of the Shah of Iran. On our last episode, Dr. Abbas Milani joined me to discuss history, new revelations, and historical revisionism when it comes to the Shah through the prism of 2020. Today, two historians with different approaches. First up, Andrew Scott Cooper on his recent book that has made a splash about the fall of the Pahlavis, and then Mohammad Amini reflecting on the Shah from a proponent of Mossadegh. This is Conversations from, to, and about the Iranian diaspora. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. This is Roqe. Welcome to episode number 39 of Roqe. امیدوار هستم که زندگیتون خوب باشه این هفته.
So poetic.
I just say things to see what Shaya's reaction is.
He's laughing. I don't know what that means.
I think it was entirely sound. I'm making sure that everybody is having a good life this week.
Oh, sorry, what did you say?
امیدوارم که زندگیتون خوب باشه.
این هفته.
این هفته.
It's actually lovely.
What do you mean, wow?
That was a big progress for you.
Your Farsi's
باجا که
improved.
فارسی که میاد حرف میزنم ولی این چیزها رو امتحان میکنم که ببینم تو چی بگی تو صورتت چی بگه. It's a very big show, this one. We have historian Andrew Scott Cooper joining me from Brussels in just a few moments, and later in the program, historian Mohammad Amini, a bevy of historians. This is on the heels of Dr. Abbas Milani, who was on the program for an in-depth 90 minutes with me on Monday. Lots of discussion about that. The whole Roqe in-studio team, as you can hear, has gathered. Groovy Shaya, hello.
Hello, Azam.
Captain Rezai Aziz.
Hello, sir.
And the fabulous Keon.
Hello, Jian.
Hello, Keon. How was your week, your hafte?
My hafta was good. Just, again, killing myself at the gym. I'm actually going to a shooting range tonight for the first time.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm excited about that.
What? And why are you doing that?
I've always wanted to. And
To shoot things?
Yes, I think I'll be really good at it.
In this era
It's scary how good I am.
Gun culture, you okay. You see the different voices of Roqe. People with different interests. Okay, all right. But you're excited about it.
Yes, I am.
Empowered, in fact.
I think I'll be really good at it. Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of announcements before we get to our guests in our letters of the week. First of all, we've launched a new feature called the Roqe Minute. This is where we take a minute from one of our interviews and post it with a title page on our Instagram. We just did a minute from our Ahmad Ismailioun, actually a heartbreaking minute from Ahmad Ismailioun from our first episode, actually 4 months ago, and put it on Instagram. On Instagram and on Telegram.
That's right.
So you can see it on Instagram and Telegram, or as I know it's said in Farsi, Telegram.
Telegram
Yeah,
it is.
in case people don't know what we're talking about, Telegram. Is it Telegram or Telegram?
Telegram.
Telegram.
Sounds more authentic.
Telegram. So we now have a Telegram. What is it? A page? A platform?
No, it's a channel.
The
It's
channel.
a
We have a Telegram channel.
People can subscribe
At
or
Roqe
join.
Media, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's Captain Reza. They're
And,
the voice of Captain Reza. Yeah.
That's right. Not to be confused with the voice of Jian.
Yes.
Never. But also, Irfan's episode, in subtitle version of it, is on our Telegram.
That's right, with the Farsi Zirnavis, with
That is correct.
the Persian subtitles, the Irfan episode, also on Telegram. If your choice is the Telegram platform, I mean, if you're listening to this, you're listening to it on another platform or already on Telegram. So all of this is kind of redundant. But maybe somebody's listening to it on Spotify and they're like, wow, I love Telegram.
That's right.
And I want to go and listen to it on that instead, right?
Yeah, and some people don't want to stream it; they want to download it. So it makes it easier for them. We're just trying to make it easy for people to find us.
On the next episode of Roqe, legendary Iranian-American broadcaster Homassar Shah will join me. She is a wonder. She's been a journalist, an interviewer, a reporter for 55 years, including for about 20 years in Iran before she left quite tragically in 1978. We'll get into that story, what happened at the Kayhan newspaper where she worked. I'm so happy and honored to have her coming on the show for a sort of lifetime interview. Homassar Shah joining us on the next episode of Roqe. Also, a special shout out on this episode again to Mo Rahimian and Inshufin. So Mo is a guy who came to the West about 20 years ago, rebuilt his life here to become an expert in financial planning, life, health, and securing wealth and insurance. His company also deals with travel insurance. So he's made it his goal to take much of the profits he makes from Inshufin and put them back into the Iranian community and the diaspora. This is the part I wanted you to hear, Kian. He says, I don't need to drive a Mercedes-Benz if I can support our culture.
Why are you directing that at me?
I'm just saying.
I actually don't drive a Mercedes, so what do you got to say to that?
I just wanted you to know. That's what he said.
That's that's kind. That's, yeah.
We have Mo Rahimian. Thank you to Mo and Inshufin for supporting Iranian events, arts and culture, this episode of Roqe as well. So, you can hire a financial advisor and do something good for the community if you hire Mo Rahimian, although he may not have a Benz, Kian.
Damn, then I'll go elsewhere. I'm just kidding. Is that true? That I've spoken to a lot of Iranians, and to them it's like real estate agents. They will drive a Benz because they think it portrays
it's
them
better
as
for business.
Yeah, it is.
BMW and Mercedes, those are the...
It makes them look successful, so then people will do business with them.
It's a strange element of our
very sad
outgrowth of our diaspora culture in some circls, of course. In some,
What do you drive, though?
I'd rather not say, Reza. What do you drive?
I don't.
Since you're asking.
I ride bike. Aww,
Shia rides a bike.
I love that. That's sweet.
All right. I know we got a lot of feedback on the last episode with Dr. Milani, and we're going to get to the letters of the week in a little bit, right?
Yes.
The fabulous Kian. See you soon. Captain Reza, Groovy Shia. Let's get to our first guest. Iranian contemporary history is probably the most contentious subject among Iranians and people of Iranian descent, and perhaps never more so than on the 40th anniversary of Mohammad Reza Shah's passing. As we have been discussing this week, whether you are into politics or not, the fateful events of 1979 have profoundly impacted your lives, even if, like me, you were a kid during the revolution, or maybe you were born after it. On Monday, we heard from Dr. Abbas Milani and his perspective 10 years after the release of his detailed book called The Shah. My first guest today is a non-Iranian who has dared to also investigate and publish a book focused on the most debated figure in Iranian affairs. Andrew Scott Cooper did his PhD in U.S.-Iran studies. He is an historian, an analyst, and the author of 2 books on the history of the modern Middle East. His first, The Oil Kings, How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East. It provides readers with a comprehensive account of America's relations with oil producers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, during the 1970s energy crisis. His second book, The Fall of Heaven, The Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran, came out in 2016 and explores the downfall of the Shah of Iran from the perspectives of family members, courtiers, revolutionaries, and diplomats. On this 40th anniversary month of the death of the Shah, whilst in exile in Egypt, Professor Cooper seems like another most relevant voice to hear from. And right now, Andrew Scott Cooper joins me from Brussels, Belgium. Hello, sir.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss the Shah today.
Thank you so much for doing this, Andrew. There is so much to get to when it comes to the Shah. Let me start with you. It would be absurd to suggest history can only be written by those of a certain background or ethnicity, but it is interesting that a guy named Andrew Scott Cooper from New Zealand did his PhD in Iran-U.S. studies and now has a book about the Pahlavi Dynasty and, of course, the end of it. Why did you gravitate towards writing about Iran and the Shah?
Well, I was also a boy in the 1970s, and I was 9 years old when the revolution happened. I remember watching the big crowds come out on the streets on TV around December, Christmas time, 1978. And it was also, that was around the time that I began reading history books, and I became sort of really obsessed with the whole study of history. I studied history at university. There was no Middle East history in New Zealand. There were no contemporary studies of that sort. But by the time I was living in the United States in 2005, 2006, I was working in office jobs in New York. I was really unhappy with my career, and I decided to test myself to essentially say, well, you know, if you think you can do a better job than the other historians, then you have to prove it to yourself. So I gave myself a year to do background research and see if there was some part of the revolutionary narrative that had been overlooked by other scholars. And I was fortunate to be the first person to access the archive of General Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor to President Ford, and he was Kissinger's deputy under Nixon. And by accessing his papers, I came across these raw transcripts of US-Iran relations, and in particular, the Shah's intimate conversations with Presidents Nixon and Ford and the senior advisors. Those papers really led me to start looking at the oil relationship between the United States and Iran. And in particular, I wondered if turmoil in the oil markets in the late 1970s had in any way contributed to instability in Iran and possibly contributing to the collapse of the Pahlavi Dynasty. So out of that inquiry came my first book, The Oil Kings.
It's interesting, I can only imagine, for an audience that we have that perhaps is largely people somehow connected to or of Iranian descent, to hear what we'd say a Khariji guy, like a non-Iranian guy, even though I'm Khariji. I mean, I grew up outside Iran, but somebody of non-Iranian descent working in this field and taking this deep dive, as I call it. But you say something interesting in the book that actually makes a lot of sense. You say that for some of your primary source Iranian interviewees, those who were on the front lines while you were researching for this book and when you were doing interviews for this book, that it was actually an asset or somehow an advantage for you to be an outsider, a New Zealand-born historian. How so?
I think the biggest asset I had was to be non-Iranian. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that many of the people who knew the Shah best and worked with him distrust the Iranian intellectual class, and the bitter differences, ideological differences that really caused so many problems while the Shah was in power have actually continued all the way through over the past 40 years. So they had also, they felt that it wouldn't matter what they said to an Iranian-born historian or scholar, their words would somehow be manipulated or phrased in a way that would reflect badly on the period and the Shah. I mean, I think as an outsider, I was able to do things like not only interview the Shahbanu and the family members and members of the entourage, but I was able to travel to Iran, and I did a short-term sabbatical in Qom as a guest of one of the universities there. Actually, a condition of my visa to go to Iran was that I had to go to Qom, and I had to do a short-term sabbatical on Shia studies.
Interesting.
That turned out to be a tremendous asset for me. It really was a fantastic experience. So on the one hand, I'm working with the family and interviewing the family members and their closest intimates. And then on the other hand, I can go to Iran and I can be in Qom where the revolution started. And my teachers were religious people. They were turbans. And then I was able to go to Paris and interview Mr. Bani Saad, who is a friend of no one, really. I spent an interesting afternoon with him. And then the fourth part of the square is I was able to talk to the Americans. They also opened up to me. So it's been an outsider. It's been not being a non-Iranian, but it's also been someone who knows how to listen and someone who I think has some diplomatic skills, which I've had for most of my career. I think I worked at the United Nations when I was very young, and then at Human Rights Watch. So I was trained as a researcher very early on. So everything for me, the whole story of the two books for me has also been a personal journey into the heart of contemporary Iranian history.
Well, I can only imagine that now that you've put this book out, you're aware that pretty much everything you say will be judged one way or another by people who are listening and have opinions about the Shah. And I guess I should, as we start to get into the details of your book, and on this 40th anniversary summer, marking the death of the Shah of Iran, and following the interview with Dr. Abbas Milani on Monday, I mean, it seems like an odd question to ask a historian, because I suspect I know the answer that you'll give, but how objective are you would be the question. On the cover of this book, The Fall of Heaven, at least the edition I have, there's a positive blurb from the Washington Post. It's a review of your book, but it also says a sympathetic, nuanced portrait. Sympathetic. And to be sure, now, it is impossible to discuss any major leader of the 20th century, let alone one that was toppled in a popular revolution, without expecting the character to be polarizing. So you would know going into this that any portrait of the Shah is going to have naysayers on one side or the other. But do you agree with the sympathetic assessment? And if so, did you enter into writing this book with a particular idea about the Shah?
The understanding I had, the background I had, was really from Oil Kings, my first book, which had really changed the way I thought about the Shah. The Shah comes across in these American documents from the 1970s that were obviously classified for 30 years. He comes across as a nationalist, as someone who's very distrustful of the Americans, but that was mainly focused on foreign defense and petroleum policy. Looking at the Shah internally, all I had to work with was a body of literature that had portrayed the Shah as this, frankly, as either a coward or as a monster. So you can imagine trying to square the circle between a coward and a monster. That these narratives have been baked in since the early 1980s, actually since the late 1970s, I think. So I went in. I did actually go in with a blank slate. And I remember one of the Shah's people who knew him very well told me a story that I found confounding in it about how gentle he was as an individual. That this was a very shy man. He was someone who absolutely abhorred bloodshed. And so I heard that, and I was listening to people telling me these stories about how he was so shy that actually he couldn't look you in the eyes. And then I was trying to square that with the human rights situation in Iran. And when I learned that the numbers of executions and imprisonments had been vastly inflated in the 1970s, I began to see that there was a real problem here with the narrative that we had been working with for 30 years, 35 years, and with the reality of the man. In terms of being sympathetic towards the Shah, I developed real sympathy for him in his last year especially. I think that is an epic tragedy, what happened in 1978, and I sort of defy anyone to look at his story and not have some sympathy with a man who is dying and is slowly losing everything he's spent his entire life working towards. I mean, it really is something out of the Persian Book of Kings.
Let me pick up on some of those points one at a time. His personality, the shyness, and the human rights situation. First, you quote the Shah quite prominently. I think you quote him twice in the book, saying, "Ingratitude is the prerogative of the people." Why did that particular comment stick out for you?
He was basically saying, I think, that it's the people's right to decide whether they want me in the country or not. I'm not going to stay in Iran if they don't want me. And I know that many Iranians who live outside Iran blame him for walking away. They say, well, he left us. He essentially, when he walked out the door, he doomed us to a life in exile, which is not entirely true, because actually the Shah was one of the last people to leave the ship in 1979, January 79. It had already collapsed. He stayed on until because he was trying to form a provisional government. But I think that it's an interesting comment, because he was saying that the people ultimately will be the ones who judge what happens to me, and it's their right. They can be ungrateful. There is a hint of arrogance there, though, isn't there, where he's talking about the people being ungrateful for what he's done to them. In my research and interviews, it did come across that he was very, I think, bitterly disappointed in the turn that the Iranian middle class in particular took in the late 1970s, and he felt that they would live to regret this. And there is a wonderful quote in the book where he says at some point, one of his courtiers comes into his office in late 1978 and says, "Your Majesty, they're tearing your statues down." And he says, "I'm not worried, because one day they will put my statues up again." So he took the long view of history as well, which I also found very interesting.
You say in the book, it is an interesting quotation, "They'll put my statues back up again," especially in the context of what's happening around the world. We see statues be put up, and we see statues taken down. So he wasn't wrong that things can change. You say, though today he is remembered as I'm quoting you, as a brutal dictator forced from power by brave people, this one-dimensional narrative is an airbrush of the historical record. One reason Andrew regularly cited for the fall of the Shah was his authoritarian rule. And yet, while he was quick in his final years to rebuff charges of, say, mass murder or the squandering, if not stealing, of Iranian people's money, he did not necessarily deny an authoritarian tendency. You actually quote him saying, "Listen, to carry through reforms, one can't help but be authoritarian." What do you make of that?
To run an authoritarian regime, I think you need to have an authoritarian personality and tendencies, and that wasn't who he was. And in some ways, that's maybe one of the fatal underlying flaws of the entire regime. The Shah was not like General Pinochet in Chile. He was not like a Saddam Hussein. He was actually a very, from all accounts, he was quite a soft, gentle man. He was extremely polite. He was very kind and respectful to everyone who worked for him. But he also believed that, especially I think after the turmoil of the 1940s and 50s, that Iran needed a period of calm and quiet in order to have, so that reforms could be put in for the future. My understanding is that period of what I would call executive rule from the throne was only intended to be temporary. He did not intend, and he knew he could not possibly hand over the throne to his son as he had ruled. He understood that Reza could not be that authoritarian king that he had been in his last 15 years. And he talked on many occasions about eventually abdicating. And certainly that was the feeling within the family, that at some point there would be a handover in the early 1980s. Of course, he's caught out by the cancer diagnosis, which is another great tragedy in the story. And he, towards the end, while he is struggling with the cancer diagnosis, he is also struggling with an economy in Iran that has turned against him because oil revenues were falling. And he was having trouble with his allies in the West. And there was the revival of Islam and a resumption of Cold War tensions in the region. So at the exact time when he had decided to liberalize, Iran is hit from several different sides. It's like trying to open up, democratize in the middle of a storm. It actually is not really possible to do that. And I think that he came to grief while he was trying to do that.
So I'm going to make liberal reforms, but I have to be an authoritarian to make sure that they happen?
Well, no, he actually had planned to step down. He was trying to transition back to what he believed was democracy. But what happened in 77, the liberalization began in 1976. It was publicly announced, and the restrictions on censorship, on freedom of assembly were gradually relaxed. He felt the first year went quite well. And so in the summer of 77, he moved into the second phase of liberalization, which allowed opposition groups like the National Front to start organizing again. And people began having peaceful protests. Now, the Khomeini people saw this as their opening, and they began baiting and goading the security forces quite successfully. And you see, as I document in the book, these events in late 1977 where you have these, what I describe in the book as cells of revolutionaries who take advantage of liberalization to try and stir public panic and discord. And they were very successful in doing that. But yes, I mean, you make a very interesting point. Is it possible for the head of an authoritarian regime to dismantle that regime peacefully and then have a handover to his chosen successor?
That's the paradox. And Andrew, I'm not sure, maybe I'm misreading it, but I thought when he's talking about that quote, to carry through reforms, I mean, look, he's been the Shah at this point by 79, by 78, for almost 40 years. And so, albeit the last 20 years really I mean, he was in his 20s. He didn't, you could sort of say, okay, let's take it from the mid-50s afterwards. But the reforms he was carrying through, you could date back to the 60s, right? So he's had the opportunity to be an authoritarian or to not be an authoritarian, if you will. And I thought that's what he was referring to, that entire period, not just the late 70s.
Well, the reforms from the White Revolution reforms from 63 onwards were social and economic in nature, predominantly social and economic. The political reforms were deliberately left out of that because the thinking at that time, and by the way, this is not just the Shah, this was the thinking of intellectuals in the West and indeed some in Iran, is that if you instituted far-reaching social and economic reforms while you were instituting political reforms, you could create a revolutionary situation in your country. I know that sounds ironic, but that was the general thinking at the time, especially coming out of the United States. The Shah believed that. He sold the Kennedy administration on that in 63, and they basically said to him, okay, we're going to take the pressure off you on the political side, show us what you can do in economics and the social side. And he was doing very well until, as I document in my first book, the oil shock really was a shock to the Iranian economy and to the Iranian society, right, and had many negative consequences. And I think that by 76, after he had tried the experiment with the Rastaki's party in 75, which was a total disaster, by early 76, he understands that he needs to start transitioning. The transition is driven by the fact that he knows he has cancer. In a way, he's a victim of his success. It's not possible, really, for an authoritarian or executive monarch to run a very complicated petropower that has the fifth largest standing army in the world. He needs to bring in experts on the political side. So you have that side of it, and you also have the Shah's instinctive distrust of democracy because he had lived through the late 40s and early 50s period with Mossadegh. And so he was always on the alert, on the lookout for a strong political personality who might challenge him or challenge the dynasty. I would also say that that was not just something that relevant only to the Shah. All the monarchies in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean at that time, whether it was Greece or Jordan, were struggling with the exact same questions that he was. So he was trying to pull off something that I think was extremely difficult to do. And we know that he, perhaps because he did not have full belief in that democratic transition, that he was very suspicious of what he was doing, he lost control of events. And that's the story of late 77, early 78. He lost control of the story.
There are so many interesting paradoxes or contradictions at work. And I had Professor Mansour Farhang on the program last week, who, of course, was intimately involved by 1979 in events in Iran. But, when I made the case to him, and he started as a kid very pro-Mossadegh and all that, that's part of his history, jailed for it, in fact. But when I said, but wasn't the Shah responsible for a great liberalization through the, say, 60s and 70s? He said, and I'm paraphrasing him probably badly, but he said something like, well, it's a great thing to give women the vote, but what does it mean if there's no democratic election? So there's these contradictions at work, right, in terms of the reforms.
Yes, and that contradiction you pointed out was something that reflective of a number of countries in West and East Asia at the same time. And you can point to South Korea, where there was a belief that the fastest way to develop a country in the developing world, the fastest way to get the economy moving and to get money into people's hands, was to put democracy on ice for a certain number of years. It's always easier to gather power as the leader, to gather power, than it is to disperse it, to give it up when you understand or you can see there's a problem developing. And that was also one of the problems the Shah was faced with, is how do you slowly give power away when you have concentrated it in your hands? The entire system is dependent on you having that power. And when you've encouraged people in the political system to really distrust each other, he had removed so many rivals. He had exiled people, or he'd given them jobs, nice jobs, and sinecures. And so when he was in need of political talent near the end, people either wouldn't work with him, or they distrusted him, or they just were not involved in politics anymore. So there was a vacuum. And we know what happened in the vacuum. We know who stepped into that vacuum.
Let me come to that. I want to stick for a second with, I said I'd come back to 2 points. The shyness that you talk about and the human rights abuses, or the lesser of the human rights abuses than we expected to find. In terms of his personality, Andrew, you explore a man very different, as you say, from an arrogant authoritarian or a Machiavellian dictator. You make the case that he was remarkably shy and modest. I mean, he was relatively diminutive. He was 5'8", didn't personally care that much about fashion or style or even material goods, you say. Didn't even want all those pictures of himself in the palaces, you say. There's a scene... All of this is quite sad. There's a scene at the White House in 1977 you describe, where the Shah is being feted with Jimmy and Rosalind Carter are there, and I think Sarah Vaughan and Dizzy Gillespie are playing on stage. He doesn't get up at the end to get up on stage and shake their hands, and this is widely interpreted in the press the next day. The narrative is he's arrogant and doesn't want to shake the hands of black musicians. And you say he was actually sitting there because he was paralyzed by shyness. Can you speak to that?
It's another one of these remarkable contradictions with the Shah, is that here you have the Emperor of Iran, who has lived a public life his entire life, and he has had to speak in public. He suffered from anxiety. I mean, this is someone who was taking a Valium every night to sleep, and had been since the 1950s. He was someone who had intestinal dietary problems, probably related to the intense levels of stress he was under. He was rigidly in control of himself all the time. And I think that in a situation where at the White House, where the Shah Banu got up very quickly, the president and Mrs. Carter, as you described, they asked the Iranian royal couple come up onto the stage and shake hands with the band. But the Shah, in some ways, was very comfortable with the court protocol that removed him from having contact with people, because he was a shy fellow. Even with his own family members, he was very shy, they tell me. He found it difficult to express himself. And it is a really sad episode. I thought that was sort of a classic case of how you have a baked-in narrative of this, awful, he's rude, he's arrogant, he's racist. And the fact is that he is just very misunderstood. And I'm not sure that the Americans ever understood the Shah. And in fact, which is remarkable when you think of the amount of money and resources they invested in Iran while he was in power and the way they depended on him. And yet, if you read the CIA intelligence analyses of him, they could be talking about someone else completely different. It's not clear to me that they're talking about the Shah, but are they really talking about the Shah as the man? And I guess I would just raise another point about this, is that they had no concept of the Shah's total and absolute commitment to Persian kingship and the Far, which is something I talk about in the book. Not once in any of the thousands of documents I've read did the Americans ever understand, or that they were even aware of the fact that their ally had a very traditional view of Persian kingship. And that's a very important thing to consider, I think.
I think it's worth stopping for a moment and saying, I said that anything you're going to say, there's going to be naysayers, there's going to be people on either side of this. I can hear a naysayer saying, or how would you respond to a naysayer saying, really? Well, how shy and modest can someone be if they're presiding over a police state in Savak? So how do we connect those two dots?
Well, the Shah was also, I think, actually related to shyness and being retired, is that having a retiring nature, is that he did not like to hear bad news. He was someone who, there was an element of self-denial there, and the human rights issue that we're talking about is really focused on the period 1971 to 76, which is, in the book I refer it to as the Iranian, as a dirty war against leftist subversion. That's when human rights in Iran became an international scandal. The security officials who worked with the Shah, who knew him well, including General Nasseri, regarded him as so soft that they really created this internal police state that, of course, he was aware that Savak was active and they were suppressing leftists, but they kept the full details of that away from him. I mean, his wife went to him repeatedly saying, this person has been locked up, this artist, this poet, this writer, this is outrageous. But he was not aware of what was happening in the prisons with the torture. I mean, I think that's quite clear to me that was the case. Because when he was informed, starting in early 76, he was the one who invited the International Committee of the Red Cross and Amnesty International and the International Commission of Jurists into Iran to conduct independent investigations. When they came back to him and they said, we have all the numbers of people who are arrested in the prisons, and you really need to focus on this, he did focus on it, and he, starting in early 77, when they released their reports, that's when you see him outlaw torture, and he turns over the prisons to the ICRC, which ironically his enemies, especially in the Islamist movement, saw as a sign of real weakness.
But it's even more than that, as you do in your book. You are a former researcher at Human Rights Watch. I mean, your career would hardly suggest that you're an apologist for human rights abuses.
No.
You claim in this book that you were astounded to find that while the Shah of Iran was no angel when it came to jailing and executing dissidents, as you just talked about, the number of human rights abuses under the Shah were, you say, dramatically lower than what the popular narrative suggests. What can you tell us about that?
The numbers are very important. And for me, because this, what I referred to earlier as a baked-in narrative, as a brutal dictator, the bloody dictator, a bit like Nicholas II of Russia, who was accused of being Nicholas the Bloody, and now we know that he was a very soft, retiring autocrat himself, or like Louis XVI of France. But that these numbers are important because they have been used for a long time to justify the caricature of the Shah as this sort of criminal, as a brutal dictator. We can't really have an honest, full discussion of the period and the man without having the numbers. And now we have the numbers, ironically, courtesy of the Islamic Republic, which did this study probably about 20 years ago now. They decided to memorialize all the victims of the Pahlavi regime, Khomeini, remember, had accused the Shah of complicity in the murders of 60 to 70,000 people, and 100,000 people in lockup, in prisons.
Right.
Those numbers had been repeated by Amnesty International in the mid-1970s. When you look at the numbers we have now, which, by the way, are confirmed by the ICRC, those numbers now have gone down from 100,000 people in prison to, in 1976, 75, 76, it was about 3,200. And from 60 to 70,000 executions, we're down to 383 people died in the Shah's prisons through a combination of torture or suicide or execution. Those numbers are important because although there were human rights abuses, I'm not saying that, and it's something I feel very sensitive about because of my background. For historians, it's very important because we need to know what the numbers were so we can have an honest revision of the entire period. I am particularly interested in numbers because in the late 1990s, when I was at the UN and Human Rights Watch, I was the person who worked on the international campaign for landmines, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. We had numbers for the landmines that were infesting more than 60 countries around the world at the end of the Cold War. We had numbers provided by governments, we had numbers provided by NGOs, by communities on the ground, and my job was to study those numbers and see, try and reconcile them. So once you reconcile the numbers, you can start to do serious investigative work. So I was very shocked, and in some ways, when the numbers came down, I remember thinking, this was in early 2013, and I had just started writing the book, and I thought, oh my God, in some ways it's a real problem for me, because if the numbers go down that dramatically for Iran, what does that say about the Shah? I mean, that raises a whole series of questions about who he was, and how did the numbers get into circulation? And as I document in the book, I actually traced foreign correspondents in the West who were responsible for putting those numbers in the Guardian newspaper and the Los Angeles Times, for example. And I interviewed them and I said, how did you get the numbers and what was your fact-checking for those numbers? And there was no fact-checking. The numbers came from Mr. Godspede, Mr. Yazdi, and Mr. Bani Saad.
What did Bani Saad say when you talked to him about that?
We had a really fascinating 3-hour discussion. Initially, he was very bored with me for about 2 hours, and then I asked him a question where he suddenly became very alert. Well, for them, they were revolutionaries. The means justify the ends. They weren't interested in the correct numbers. What they were interested in doing was creating the perception in the West that the Shah was a monster and that he was a terrible guy and that they would do a better job of running Iran than he would. And the Shah made a real mistake when he thought, and he said, I can't believe anyone would believe this nonsense. This is rubbish, and I'm not going to dignify it with a response. These numbers are so crazy. The idea that you could have 100,000 people locked up in Iran at that time was ridiculous because the prison capacity was just not there. And if there were 100,000 people taken off the streets, where were the families who were missing their relatives? So the foreign correspondents were very sympathetic to the revolutionaries. This was the early 70s, remember, when in the Middle East there were all sorts of rebel and revolutionary movements that had sort of an aura of romanticism about it. So they repeated these numbers, and one of the reporters told me that this Mr. Godspede would come by the bureau in Beirut where he lived at that time, and he would say, look, Jonathan, I've got a story for you, can you just run it for me? And Jonathan would put it in the Washington Post, and I said to him, I don't understand how you can do that. How are you're just repeating what Godspede is giving to you? And he said, Andrew, all I can say is that the period of the times. He said these were revolutionary movements, and there was a general sympathy, there was antipathy towards the Shah.
But Andrew, the narrative wasn't just written by the revolutionaries. I mean, it's created, the narrative around the Shah for the years after the revolution has been created from all corners, including the Americans and the British. Both British Ambassador Parsons and American Ambassador Sullivan, who were there at the time, have written these autobiographies and painted a very negative picture of Mohammad Reza Shah, pretty much depicting him as this demoralized, indecisive, weak character clinging to their sleeves like a lost child in his final days in Iran. What do you make of those characterizations?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like a loser in history. I mean, after the revolution, everyone heaped every sort of opprobrium on the Shah because he had lost. And Parsons and Sullivan both had reasons for not talking about certain aspects of their role as what they were doing in the late 70s. I mean, Parsons was he missed the entire revolution. He missed the biggest story in modern Iranian history. And Mr. Sullivan, nowhere in his autobiography, which is a very thinly written, if anyone's read it, it's a very interesting, thinly written document. He doesn't talk about his secret opening to Mr. Bazargan in the spring of 1978, or indeed to his desire, his recommendation to Washington in late 78 that Khomeini would make a really great head of state because he would be like Mahatma Gandhi, and he could keep the army in line, and we would have an anti-communist Iran, and the Shah was finished, and Bazargan would be the prime minister. I mean, that was really the idea that they had. I interviewed his underlings in the embassy. There were 3 of them who were still alive at that stage. Unfortunately, the Shah has died, and he was very honest with me. Charlie Nass, a wonderful guy who felt it had been a complete disaster. The other 2 were very defensive of Sullivan and of the strategy that they had and then they wouldn't accept that they had made a mistake, although they seemed to understand that they had in the course of my interviews with them.
There's ample evidence that has surfaced in recent years definitively proving high levels of coordination between Khomeini's most inner circles and the Americans prior to the revolution. I've heard this theory. You tell me. Is it conceivable that the whole occupation of the U.S. embassy in Tehran could have been a cover-up operation? What do you make of the people who say that?
I have not studied the embassy takeover. There's a lot we still don't know from that period. There's a lot we're still finding out, and that's why this is such a rich area of exploration. It requires really solid investigative research. For example, one of the things that I found out I thought was very interesting was that the CIA was tapping the Shah Banu's telephone line in the palace in late 78. I found out that the head of French intelligence in the French embassy in Tehran knew that the Shah had cancer. These things weren't known even 10 years ago. But when we find information like that out, it helps us better understand the motives of the Western powers as well, as they watched the Shah flailing in late 1978 and wondered why he was not ordering the crackdown that they believed could have saved the regime.
That's a great segue, because where I wanted to go, I want to zoom out and look at where we are 40 years hence and 40 years after the death of the Shah. First, let's talk about the revolution. You say in the book that researching the Iranian Revolution, I'm quoting you, is like entering a dark tunnel without a flashlight. Well, we know that there were massive amounts of people in the streets wanting change and then welcoming the arrival of Khomeini. And then we also know that most of those people who prosecuted the revolution alongside Khomeini and were not part of the Islamic formalists pivoting towards theocratic rule were either killed or forced to leave the country. And we know that subsequently the current regime has proceeded with a level of authoritarianism that makes the Shah's era pale in comparison. So why is it such a dark tunnel? And why, from your perspective, is there so much disagreement in the diaspora?
Because controlling the historical narrative is critical to the survival of the Islamic Republic. In fact, the Islamic Republic has made the narrative of the revolution the justification for its existence. And so there's a fight going on at the moment over control, who gets to control the narrative. It's very interesting to me that Oil Kings was translated inside Iran and published inside Iran because the regime thought that the book revealed the Shah to have made serious miscalculations towards the Saudis in the late 1970s. And they were trying to score points against the Saudis, and they were trying to use this as a nationalist argument against Saudi Arabia at home. But with Fall of Heaven, when the book came out, there was just a torrent of abuse that was directed at me. And in fact, the regime created 12 websites offering free translations of the book to Iranians. And if you clicked on the website to get your free download, the Iranian intelligence services gained control of your computer. They essentially sucked all the information out because they want to know who's interested in the Shah. If you're interested in the Shah, that suggests that you might have counter-revolutionary subversive tendencies. It's like, for example, every so often there's a rumor that goes around that the Shahbanu has died. And she's well aware of this because she has people who phone her and say, Your Majesty, I was so worried. I thought, I'd heard that you had passed away. And she laughs about this, but the reason that the regime is behind these rumors is that they want to see the reaction on the streets of Tehran. They want to know that when she dies, they want to know who's going to come out into the streets to mourn her or to stage a protest for the monarchy. So this is a game of shadows that's going on. Some of it's public and a lot of it's not. And for those of us who dip our toe into the waters, there are piranhas in the water, and it's very it requires a bit of a thick skin, I think, to delve into the revolution. And I will just say this as well, this writing about the revolution, I found, was a very, very dark, depressing topic as a historian. It was a very sad topic. Most of my interviewees wept during our encounters, and I'm including the Americans in that too, American nationals who were in Tehran during the revolution. It is clear that if you lived through the revolution, you were traumatized, and I'm sure that many of your listeners who are younger will have experience with parents or grandparents who lived through the revolution and probably carried that trauma with them still today.
Yes.
So it is a very dark subject because of the outcome. It wasn't like the French Revolution where you could say, well, there were these themes of egalite, fraternité, liberté, etc. The Iranian Revolution is a tunnel that keeps getting darker and darker, and we're still in that tunnel today, I think.
When you talk about Andrew, the torrent of abuse you said that you received when this book came out, from whom?
Oh, there's a wave of trolls, an army of trolls that came after me. The book had been released on a Tuesday. There was a book review in the New York Times book review on Friday. I think it was posted on the Friday night. And the reviewer accused me of being anti-Islamist, which I thought was quite a strange thing to say. But I knew what that person was. That person was actually, this was like red meat. I knew what she was doing. She was essentially putting me out there in the public square to be torn apart, and that's what happened. In fact, the abuse and the threats were so great that on the Monday, Amazon, which now unfortunately has to have a standing committee of people who meet every day to consider threats and violence and abuse against authors online, they met. And they had to go through my Amazon page and clean it up because the trolls the abuse was just so awful. And I closed down all my social media accounts. It was dangerous at that time. This was in summer of 2016. To be accused of that was when the book is not really, it's not about that at all. I found very unsettling and disturbing at the time. Historians are very much on the front line of the culture wars that are going on now. And so you would think that because we're in the academy, we are somewhat elevated or removed from what's going on. Actually, historians are coming under sustained and severe attack from authoritarian regimes and their supporters. And it gets very personal, and it's very unpleasant.
You know, your book itself seems to be evidence of a shifting popular narrative about the Shah of Iran and how he is seen as a historical figure. So the question is, as we're well into this interview, and back to the precipitant for it, on this 40th anniversary of his death in exile, how do you believe he and his years as the ruler of Iran are seen differently from, say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago?
I think it's safe now to talk about his accomplishments. It's not always about Savak. It's not always about the human rights side. We can now look at the human rights side, and you can look at education, literacy, healthcare, the environment, all of the legislative achievements that he put in place. You can look at the infrastructure he put into Iran. You can really have for the first time now, we're far enough away from the revolution to have a really honest, sober discussion of who this man was and what he was trying to achieve. And that's what the study of history is all about. I love what I do because it's investigative work, and it is very it's rewarding for me to have young Iranians, or Iranians of all ages actually, who will write to me and say, I read your book and I learned a lot, and this is not what I thought happened, and they thank me, and that's really wonderful. I love hearing those. I always write back to people. I make my books accessible. I don't want to write just for the academy. I want to write for anyone who's interested in a good story, good historical story, and everything that I do is very carefully documented and backed up. I think Fall of Heaven has 2,200 footnotes. But
could you have written this book in 1990? Could you have even written this book in 2000?
No, it's not. It wasn't possible. No, it actually, this book was made possible by The Oil Kings, my first book. That book was read by a number of Iranians on different sides of the political spectrum, and there was a general consensus that whoever this person is, he's doing something different, and I will talk to him if he approaches me.
But vis-a-vis the feelings about the Shah in the diaspora,
yes.
When you say you're allowed to talk about his accomplishments now, when did that change? Since when has that become okay?
I would say the last 10 years. It's now becoming, and there's I think there's going to be a lot of scholarship on the social programs, on what went right. It's okay to say that, we know that things went wrong. Of course they went wrong. There was a revolution, but we can also now say a lot of things actually went right, and we know that because those programs that he and also the Shah Banu instituted in Iran, many of them actually survived to this day. They were not demolished by the Khomeini people when they came in. They just changed the names. They purged the people who ran the programs, and they put them in a different direction, but they kept them more or less intact because those programs were working really well. He was the great builder of modern Iran, and if you avoid talking about him, you're not talking about the modern history of Iran. You can't get around this guy. I found it fascinating that Iranians are completely captivated by the Shah. And when I asked them, why aren't you interested in Khomeini? I mean, I never hear this level of interest in Ayatollah Khomeini. Their eyes glaze over. They have no interest at all in talking about the Ayatollah.
But which Iranians are you asking?
Even inside Iran, there was no interest in Khomeini. In fact, I went when I was in Qom. The religious people who hosted me, who were very kind, they took me up to Tehran, to Khomeini's house in the northern suburbs, and there was a smattering of people there, and it was a hot day, and I thought, well, it's the weather. But then they took me to I insisted on going to Nia Varan, actually, Sadabad, I should say, and then Nia Varan. And at Sadabad, there was lines of people outside the gate. There were hundreds of people walking around the grounds, and my guide was embarrassed and uncomfortable because he could see that people did not want to go to Khomeini's house. They wanted to go to see the Shah's house. They were interested in the Pahlavis.
Interesting.
and that struck me as a very interesting how Iranians are, what the interest of the Iranian people right now is in that history before the revolution.
Before I let you go, I'm grateful for how much time you have given us. Let me try this on you. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about in having finished your book and thinking about this conversation and the broader context of what's happening in the world right today, you know, on the streets of Portland in the U.S. or different part or Hong Kong. Is it somehow odd that at a time of global reckoning around powerful establishment leaders or monarchs or authoritarianism, certainly in the view, say, of the Black Lives Matter movement and democracy protests around the world and in the United States, that in the case of Iran, the inclination is around the rehabilitation of the image and legacy of a king of kings? What do you make of that?
I find it fascinating. I find it fascinating. It's why Iran is so it's so compelling. The culture, the history, the society, and the people are endlessly interesting to me. It is really fascinating because they are clearly looking to the past, the immediate past, for inspiration and for some kind of solace and for answers, I think, as to what happens when the Islamic Republic is gone. What are we going to do? And it's an interesting discussion, I think, going on. I think that there's more than nostalgia. There's a real longing for that Persian tradition of constitutional monarchy and kingship, and that the Islamic Republic is somehow illegitimate. That it's people, they seem to behave as though it's almost like a regime of occupation. So we shall see what happens, but it's a story that still has to play out, and ultimately the Iranian people will decide what their future is and what happens next.
Well, let me ask you a final question then about your hunch on that, because I know the study of history doesn't give you a crystal ball, but beyond any dewy-eyed nostalgia or aspirational hopes of those who want to see a particular return of the Pahlavis, say, as someone who has now acquired a wealth of knowledge on Iran and Iranians and who's been to all those places to do the research you've done, do you think there is any chance that we see the reestablishment of monarchy in Iran?
I think you can't rule it out simply by the fact that Iran has had, the Persian monarchy is over 2,000 years old, and the Islamic Republic is 40 years old. The Islamic Republic is really a dynasty as well. I mean, so the Iranian history is the story of dynasties, and when you consider the rise and fall of the dynasties, I think even the people running Iran today understand that they are not going to be there forever, that dynasty is going to fall. At that point, there will have to be some kind of constitutional convention, and every possibility, every option will be discussed. And so I wouldn't rule it out, no. I think that it would be at least contemplated, and it depends on whether anyone puts themselves forward for that position and whether it's an appropriate, a position for the future. But certainly when you see over 100,000 people, young people, gathering outside Cyrus's tomb, as they did, I think it was 5 years ago, you can't just write that off as simple nostalgia. There's something else going on, and it's a very interesting phenomenon to watch. I can't think of another exiled royal family that has ever had this amount, this degree, depth of popular support after being out of the country for so long. I think this is very unique.
Andrew Scott Cooper, I thank you so much for the time you've given us today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Andrew Scott Cooper, a historian, analyst, author of 2 books on the history of the modern Middle East, including his latest book, The Fall of Heaven, The Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran. Andrew Scott Cooper joined us from Brussels, Belgium today. The fabulous Keon has returned to the studio. Captain Reza, Groovy Shaya, Andrew Scott Cooper. That was most interesting. I quite enjoyed talking to him. Reflections on that? Shaya?
First of all, I'm very happy that he was in Belgium.
Brussels, yeah.
Brussels, that the connection was great.
Yes. Thank you. Shaya relieved that the technical worked out. Yeah, no, actually he sounded good. Yeah.
Yes. And so, I like Shah, and I'm not saying that I am pro-Shah. I mean pro-monarchy or...
Okay.
But I think a lot of people disagree with Andrew Scott Cooper because I think he has a lot of sympathy with Shah, and a historian maybe not has to have a lot of sympathy, but that's...
Well, you're right. Some people certainly disagree with him, including Dr. Milani, who was on Monday, and as he mentioned in the interview on Monday, wrote a rather scathing review of Professor Cooper's book. But I think there's going to be a lot of people who agree with him as well. Reza?
I can just stop the show right now and listen back to the interview one more time. It was so engaging and interesting, and ending it with that music, first of all, I gotta say that because I really enjoyed it. I find it fascinating, very fascinating, that a non-Iranian has been able to get access, and probably, I mean, Shaya says that this guy is probably not unbiased because of his sympathy towards the Pahlavi Dynasty, but I think on the other hand, because he's not Iranian, I feel like he was able to gain more access to a lot of archival. Yeah,
he said that. He says that in the book, and he said it in the interview, and you could absolutely see that, right? That
totally.
People consider him a more sort of objective person as he's entering the room somehow, because he's not Iranian, so he doesn't have a horse in the race somehow.
Very true.
And that's what he was implying. Keon, how did you feel?
I was going to say I appreciate the fact that he's a non-Iranian that has that kind of different view of Iran from the outside. Because listen, like, we're all Iranian, we all have our opinions of what happened, our opinions about the Shah. So it's kind of refreshing to hear a different view of it, and like you said, he probably had access to a lot more interviews with people that were close to the Shah. These people don't trust the other, like, for example, Abbas Milani. He was one of the reasons the revolution happened. I was going to say, actually, I read Abbas Milani's book at the beginning of quarantine, The Shah, and it absolutely...
Oh, recently?
Yeah, it absolutely tore me apart. I couldn't get out of bed for, like, I think a full day,
because
it was just so heartbreaking, just you hear of these stories, but when you're reading about, like, the Shah, he did not see it coming. Like, he had this view of...
Milani definitely points, it is a lonely figure in the end, the way you come away, no matter what your opinion, thinking about the Shah after reading that book. It's not dissimilar reading The Fall of Heaven, if you're interested in reading.
I was going to say...
you were going to say you probably...
I have that waiting.
You want to be able to get out of bed.
I have that sitting on my shelf. I was like, I'm going to read it next. I was like, I need a bit of a break after that. So
I suspect it's going to be interesting, the reaction we get, because I suspect that it probably has to do with where you already come from. People have so many baked in opinions about, even though this series is about how opinions are evolving and narratives are changing over time historically, as we talked about with each person, and I want to talk to Mohammad Amini coming up in a few moments about as well. I suspect that if you come into this being fervently anti-Shah, or having an opinion that's different from Cooper, and you're Iranian, you're probably going to say he's misinformed, he's not Iranian, doesn't know what he's talking about, and if you're sympathetic to what he's saying, you're going to say, oh, well, it's great that an outsider wrote this book. And
actually, my parents, like, out of all the writers, they agree with him
with
the
Cooper,
most, because they're very pro-Shah.
For me, it's very different, because I'm looking at it from a very different perspective. For me, it's the fun facts that are very interesting, like him getting a visa to go to Iran, and then
having to go to Qom.
Having to go to Qom. Wasn't that amazing? Like,
did they know what he was writing about? How did they
probably not the way he was writing, probably, but that's fascinating.
Okay. We got Mohammad Amini standing by. We're going to get to him in just a little bit. Let's get to Letters of the Week. One job to do, Kian. One job to do.
Listen, I have like some,
Yeah,
trying
what?
to open up the letters
Okay,
or
all right,
minimize. I was looking for it.
No
and
problem.
then I
No
go,
problem.
"Ah."
Should we play Ali Reza Qurbani again?
One more time for the cheap
I
seats
can
in
listen
the
to
back.
that all day.
Okay, so
go. All right, yeah.
so as we all know, this week's Roqe Series commemorated the 40th anniversary of the Shah's death. So we're reflecting on how impressions of the Pahlavi Dynasty may be changing over time. So to start this week on episode 38, we had a feature interview with the acclaimed academic and historian Abbas Milani. He's most well known as the author of the book The Shah, as I mentioned earlier. And so in this long-awaited interview, he discussed the Pahlavi dynasty in depth, as well as his own personal journey from activism and imprisonment, which led to his career in academia. So a few people wrote about that interview. We have a Chain Analyst, username Chain Analyst on YouTube wrote, "Every Iranian should listen to this interview." I agree.
Thank you, Chain Analyst.
As well, we have Ali Reza Bagherli on YouTube wrote, "Thanks for a great interview. I can't get enough of Milani. He is the perfect person to listen to when it comes to Iran's contemporary history."
Okay.
That's right.
Ali Reza Bagherli, a fan. Thank you for that letter.
And then we have YouTube username TO, I believe it stands for Toronto, but could be wrong, on YouTube wrote, "Thanks for the interview. Dr. Milani has a commanding knowledge of Iran's history. My question is, how useful is the psychoanalysis of political figures? How do their intentions matter? Their acts are what matter and affect people's life. This is what should be analyzed, not how shy the Shah was. Doesn't Dr. Milani think that the Shah was returned to power by the US and the UK? I am looking forward to the coming episodes, in particular, Mr. Amini."
Sounds like T.O. is a fan of Mohammad Amini and also of Mossadegh, probably.
Yeah, it sounds like
By the way, I think the psychoanalysis of political figures probably is important because so much of what guided the Shah's decision making, or for Khomeini for that matter, has to do with psychology, etc.
Yeah.
But I understand the point that this person is making.
Moving on, we have Alpine Ibex, username Alpine Ibex on YouTube wrote, "The music selection at the end of each episode is so on point. I would never come across these tracks randomly." I agree. Like some of the music that you've played, I'm like, wow, where has this been all my life?
Well, I'd say sometimes that's me, and like today, but most of the time that's the incredible Shaya.
Shaya, you have
fabulous Kian on the incredible Shaya. I might upgrade you from groovy Shaya.
You should make him captain.
Just when we're talking about the music you pick, though.
Yeah, I know.
You have great taste in music.
Yeah, it does.
It's always, partly sometimes when Shaya picks a song, he's lacing in some lyric that has to do directly with something that someone's just said, and he's thinking about it on the fly as the interview's happening. He's finding the music, and it's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's
and
beautiful.
then other times I choose the music and he disagrees with it at first and then plays it and loves it, like today.
Yes.
Like the Ali Reza Qurbani, you weren't sure at first though.
Yes.
Okay.
It went along with the theme of today,
Yes.
I'd say. And then we have Reza Ain on YouTube wrote, "What an interview. Damatun Gam, Roqe and Jian John. I have read the book The Shah many times. The book basically gives you a good vision of what went on during the Shah's tenure and is more focused on negative things about the Shah. I wonder if you were to have Reza Pahlavi on the show to give his point of view on the book as well as the events, how would it go? Now the question is, are you considering inviting Reza Pahlavi on the show?" And then we have Sultan BC, username Sultan BC on YouTube wrote, "Jian John, 50 people are still commenting on the Mother Shahla episode because our people like to dictate how others live. She chose India because she likes to live in India. If she chose Iran..."
Wait, he posted this on the Abbas Milani episode?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Wants to make sure we see this message.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
If she chose Iran, she'd have to answer to more nosy people asking, "Why are you single, skinny, and why are you doing this?" The state of our country is a mirror of our culture. We are our own life that we create.
All All right. By the way, that's a reference to episode 36 and Shahla Etifar, Mother Miracle, who chose a couple of decades ago to leave a life of materialism and give back and build a school in India. And there was some concern among commenters or dissent
critics,
with her critics of her choices, that why didn't she do this in Iran as opposed to India? And then some people have argued back, and so who knew that Mother Miracle was going to be our most controversial character?
So
but
controversial.
The letters continue, so thank you, Sultan BC, for weighing in on that on a different episode.
And then we have a username on Instagram. The username is Call Me Ismail. Wrote, "To whom should we thank for returning Jian to us from CBC? Thanks for the marvelous Roqe episodes, Jian. By the way, I wish you'd make a Persian version of the episodes, or a Persian closed caption, perhaps."
That letter was perhaps written before the Erfan subtitle.
It sure was.
But thank you, and I will call you Ishmael. If that's thank you for those comments. Appreciate it.
All right, and then we have another Instagram user, Marzieh. She wrote, "What a wonderful interview. Just one thing. A couple of episodes ago, Jian and Kian are arguing about the proper pronunciation of the word diaspora. I don't argue whether Jian's pronunciation is correct, but I'm pretty sure that Kian's pronunciation is correct, and today is the best day of my life."
Right. Well, so you think that Cayenne's pronunciation is correct instead of listen, Cayenne, you
Listen, Jian.
exactly,
so wrong.
exactly. Iran. I did actually talk to my sister about this, who is an incredible. She's incredibly smart in general, but she's also happens to be a professor of linguistics, and she said, drum roll, please, both versions are correct, and that is to say that there are different ways of saying things. So diaspora and diaspora are two options, in the same way that you would say I am anti-Shah or I am anti-Shah or anti-Khomeini, anti-Khomeini, and that the way we say things are governed often by where we live, our status, our gender, our age group, etc. She said incredibly intelligent people say, for example, diaspora, and those who no, she didn't say that. She didn't know. The last part she didn't say.
Peasants and commoners says that.
Pretty sure I heard Reza Milani say diaspora. So who's smart now?
Reza Milani? Is that
Abbas Milani.
Oh man.
So anyway, there are different ways of saying it, and so they're both correct. And I will continue to say diaspora.
That was
Thank you,
Shaya.
Who was that?
That was Shaya.
Siri,
Was
right?
that Siri?
The Google.
That was the Google person.
So, who do you want to debate now? All right, let's.
Thank you.
My way's better, but anyway,
Yes.
moving on. Hope, wow, perfect segue. We have the letter of the week. So this week,
By the way, Mohammad Amini is coming up. This poor man has been waiting. I think we got him on the phone a while ago, right?
Yeah,
so,
we did.
Okay,
right,
I'll rush through it. Letter of the week this week goes to a Farid Ameryoun on Facebook. Wrote, "That was pure gold. 90 minutes on the modern history of Iran by one of the country's top scholars. Parallel to some of your previous guests, Dr. Milani is unapologetic for his role in the downfall of the last regime. Many Iranians refused to exonerate him and other intellectuals of his era for their participation in the events leading to the 1979 revolution. Setting that point aside, Dr. Milani is the most prominent defender of a secular and democratic Iran today and holds the most promising outlook. Reiterating what Professor Farhang stressed in his interview, Dr. Milani offers the path to liberating Iran by uniting the many scattered groups in exile and the millions of Iranians inside the country that oppose the brutality and incompetence of the current regime. Thank you for this brilliant and long-awaited interview." Beautiful.
What a detailed letter. Thank you, Farid Ameryoun. Thank you, the fabulous Kian, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. And we'll get to more letters next week on Letters of the Week. Okay, and now to continue our series on this 40th anniversary summer marking the death of the Shah of Iran. We've heard from Dr. Abbas Milani, whose comments have created a great deal of discussion. We've just heard from Andrew Scott Cooper, who's written a more perhaps generous appraisal of the Pahlavi Dynasty and the final years. But as the late Shah's record is one of the most contentious and divisive subjects of contemporary Iranian history, it should come as no surprise that Andrew Scott Cooper's account has generated strong pushback by other historians. My next guest is one of those critics. Prominent Iranian historian Mohammad Amini has done extensive research on the 1953 coup and is the son of a close confidant of the late Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Professor Amini began his political life as a supporter of Shapur Bakhtiar, the last prime minister of Imperial Iran, but he is famed for his research on subjects varied from modernity to constitutional revolution to tribal and ethnic discourses in Iran, the Islamic movement, and the formation of a nation-state in Iran. Mohammad Amini is a prolific author whose books include Tradesmanship with History, a factual investigation into the 1953 coup aimed at debunking the misinformation campaign against Mossadegh, and The Time and Life of Ahmad Kasravi. Right now, Mohammad Amini joins me from Orange County, California. Hello, sir.
Thank you very much. I just have to make one correction. I'm not a professor. I don't teach anywhere, so I appreciate that, but I just have to make sure that people don't don't make that mistake. Thank you very much.
I appreciate the correction. I think I project professorship onto all historians. So can I call you a historian?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Before we get into some of this, I mean, you would be among that flight of intellectuals who left Iran during or after 1979. And as I say, before we get into the debated historic questions, give us some background, some context about your personal experience in those volatile months before and after the revolution, and what created the conditions for you to leave Iran for the last time.
Well, I, just like Dr. Milani, I came from a background of activities in the United States in the student movement against the Shah, and very idealist at the time. Everybody was idealist at the time. I went to Iran a year before revolution, and I witnessed everything, and it was amazing. And I was involved in a lot of things, and I stayed there for survived there actually for 4 years. And the biggest issue that I confronted at the time that I was in Iran before revolution was when Bakhtiar was selected by the Shah to be the prime minister, and the Jabhat Milli the National Front was against that, and my father was very important in that relationship, and had spent a lot of times in jail with Bakhtiar. And when Bakhtiar came to power, it was pretty much too late. It was a movement that had gone from the point of possible reform to the point of no return. And it was a very, very sad situation for a person like me to see Iran collapse into the hands of the Islamic, fundamentalists and people that have no clue even to how to turn the television, into the for themselves. So yes, it was a sad situation. Basically, I watched, very close by, the collapse of all at least the superficial elements of modernity in Iran, and everything else that was created.
Right.
And under the banner of Marg bar Shah, down live United States and all of that, Iran actually going to a very, very wrong direction. And that was the biggest issue at the time.
When you say, like Dr. Milani, you returned to Iran for a time in the mid-70s, you were also, like him, pro-revolution, or at least sympathetic to it before things turned and it was co-opted by the Islamic formalists. Would that be correct?
Oh, absolutely. There's nobody at my age group of 18 to 24 that was not for a change, major change, everybody was for that, but none of us were for this kind of, so-called revolution. We wanted a change. And I was like that too. I was a young kid. I liked it, the change. And then very soon I realized that this is a change. I'll tell you when I realized that. When I came from Isfahan to Tehran on the night that Tehran was burning, when Shah basically declared control in 12 cities. And that night when Tehran was burning, and I was looking at the people that were burning Tehran, I said, really? Are these the guys that we are going to leave the country to? So it just shook me. And after that, we realized that we are basically confronting a mob. And at the same time, a gorgeous movement of democracy and all of that, which had really limited leadership. So, yes, there was a problem at position and opposition. If Shah had heard the voice of the revolution a year earlier, and the opposition had heard to that, if somebody like Bakhtiar or Sadeghi or Sanjabi or somebody like that was put into power a year before, 2 years before, Reza Pahlavi would be king of Iran right now.
So just to clarify, when exactly did you end up leaving?
4 years after revolution, after my kids were singing, and I mean the Arabic, so-called initial national anthem of Iran, I told my wife at the time, we gotta leave. And of course, I was in danger all the time, and because of my father's relationship with people that were known in the government, I was kind of safe, but at the same time, I didn't feel safe. So my kids and my wife, at the time, they left from the mountains of Kurdistan, and I left from Mehrabad with a bribe. I never went back again.
Wow. So let me get into this, the historiography of what we can look at in terms of what happened 40 years ago from the prism of 2020. As more and more diplomatic communiques from the late 70s are declassified, a revisionist historical approach, it seems, is emerging with regard to the Iranian Revolution, and specifically regarding the record of the late Shah of Iran. And this new approach tends to challenge that conventional wisdom that overwhelmingly blames the late Shah for everything from being an authoritarian dictator to a weak puppet of Western powers and everything in between. Is now the time to redraw historic conclusions?
Yes, it is. Actually, it's the best time to do that because Iran is, in a sense, pregnant with future. I think Iran is going to change. Iran is going to change dramatically in the next few years. And because of the position of Iran, historically, geographically, economically, and the influence it has in the whole region, that change is going to change Middle East. So that review is very important. But let's go back and review. We have this long article by one of the most profound economic, ministers in, at least in the last 70 years of Iran, Ali Naqi Ali Khani, in the introduction to Memoirs of Alam. He is the best. That is the best analysis from somebody who was from within the government, who was inside the government, who was responsible in building the economy. That he basically says that the Shah screwed it. He had the best economy, he had popularity, but his issue of selfishness, issue of dictatorship, concepts of him being it, really destroyed it for himself. Let me go back, if I may. After the coup of 1953, which I've written a lot about, and I hate the elites of the people around the Shah for that, but after that, at the beginning of the 40s, the Iranian 40s, the American 50s,
yes,
or 60s, actually, I should say, Shah started reforms. And those reforms, actually, along with the increase in the oil prices, were the biggest most important reforms, social reforms in the Iranian history, about women, about land, about just about everything. When we get to beginning of the 1970s, Shah is the most popular king. You know, as a historian, I can tell you, from the time of Nasser-ad-Din Shah, which at the time the popularity was basically mandated, he was popular, he was accepted, and the opposition groups were absolutely non-existent. Jabhat Milli was nobody. The left was just an underground, few groups that had no influence. And this man could have changed the course of history, used his popularity with all the social reforms to political reforms. And if he had done that, his son would be the Shah of Iran right now. He didn't. And that is the biggest issue with the Shah, that he didn't use that popularity of reform, which made him an extremely popular individual at the end of the 40s, when he actually started the White Revolution and Inqilab Shah Millat and things like that.
Yes.
I still don't understand why not.
There's conflicting ideas around who he was and what he did. So I was just speaking with Andrew Scott Cooper, who makes the claim that the Shah was actually quite shy and modest and not the arrogant dictator that he's been made out to be. Do you think the way the Shah has been portrayed in personal terms has been unfair in the last 4 decades?
There's not enough information at hand to judge that, but there's a point to Professor Cooper about this. Shah was a very weak individual. You want to know about a person, you have to read the memoirs of the closest people to him. And one of the closest people to him, that to the end of life loved him, was Soraya. And in that phenomenal book, The House of Solitude, which is, of course, in French, written by a Frenchman with the help of Soraya, she mentioned so many points that the Shah is so lonely, so scared, that every time there's a problem, he actually packs his suitcase. He wants to go out. He wants to just leave. Basically, you get this impression that Mohammad Reza Shah was the second Shah after Ahmad, the first Ahmad Shah and then Mohammad Reza Shah, that they became reluctant Shahs, reluctant kings. During World War II, when Iran was invaded by Allied, Shah was a reluctant king. He was very scared at the beginning. Gradually, he discovered his power. And to the end, I don't think he was a bloodthirsty dictator. He was a very, very not very confident individual to the end. And even to the point that Kaiser comes to Iran and says, "Sir, you have to leave tomorrow." And he asks, in the morning or afternoon. There's a huge difference between his character and his father, that was begging Furi to stay in Iran, even if he's not a Shah. So, yeah, he had basically issues with his character.
What about the notion that new evidence shows that, according to historians like Cooper, there were significantly less human rights violations, less abuses, less executions under the Shah in the 1970s than the world had been led to believe in the run-up to the end and the aftermath of the revolution? What is your take on that?
Oh, absolutely, that's true. I met Shokrullah Paknejad, which, we called him Shokri, one of the longest prisoners. And he was critical of the activities of the groups of people that I belong to, Milani belonged to. We were opposition, student opposition, young kids outside of Iran, which we exaggerated the number of Iranian prisoners to 100,000 and all of that. And he was saying, listen, at the high time of arrest, we were only about 5,000 people in jail. Yes, there were torture, there were a lot of things. There's no question that there were, abuse of power and use of human rights, but it was exaggerated. It was grossly exaggerated. My father went to jail 11 times, from the coup to the time he left Iran. And every time that he actually went to jail, the head of Savak or somebody in the Savak would call, and my father would pack his bag and then go to jail, and then stay for 10 days, 15 days, 3 months, 6 months, and come back. No scars. The opposition outside was successful in claiming that and establishing it and selling it, and then the Bernard Nasser Committee in London actually made it official, and once they said that, it was totally accepted. There was dictatorship, there was torture in Iran, there were political prisoners in Iran, but the amount of it, basically the level of it was exaggerated. There's no question about it.
Mohammed, could it be, as Abbas Milani suggested to me on Monday, that the different and often contradictory profiles of the late Shah, offered by different historians, may all have truth in them, truth to them, in the sense that the Shah may have demonstrated vastly different personality traits at different stages of his rule and at different stages of his life?
Absolutely. That goes without saying. We can say that about Reza Shah too. But then look at the life of the Queen of Iran, Shah Banu. I've never met her. I don't have any sympathy to her, but her closest friend was Hajibi, a major figure in the left who actually went to Cuba a few times with Hajibi, and Farah was sympathetic to him. And there were levels of freedom in Iran that nobody realized at the time, especially in the social area. Political, the man was crazy about it. He should have let that political freedom, thrive. He would not have been thrown out of, his rule. The issue is the society became so divided that when the Islamic extremists came and took over the whole revolution, there was nothing to stop them. Realistically speaking, yes, we could have lived a different way at the time. Well, that's for people that make movies.
But how do you explain why the Shah of Iran, who as you say, presided over tremendous reforms, modernity, was incredibly popular by the early 70s, why he didn't have better instincts for what the people would want and expect around the political suppression that happens throughout the 70s and into the late 70s that ultimately is one of the reasons for his downfall?
Just like any other dictator, they don't trust people around them. They think that they're doing these things in order to gain against them, instead of accepting things that people like Ali Khani were doing and other peoples within the cabinet were doing. Instead of taking advantage of that, he thought that these people are conspiring against him. That's a concept of dictatorship. Look at this. At the beginning of the rise of Reza Shah, every intellectual from Mashrute, from Constitutional Revolution, was around Reza Shah. At the end, everybody's gone. Some are dead, some are killed, some are in jail, some have escaped the country. The same thing happened to Mohammad Reza Shah. The problem with dictatorship is mistrust of the people that tell you the truth, rather than understanding that these people are telling you what to do. They go after exactly the same people that are telling you the truth, and dictator thinks that he knows the best. He can actually run the country without anybody. So at the end, Shah is a lonely guy. Nobody's around him to advise him.
Let me ask you about the revolution itself and your take on it. One other area that's receiving more scrutiny by researchers is the alleged connections between the revolutionaries, the mullahs, in fact, and foreign powers, primarily the United States and Britain, in the months leading up to the revolution. Based on your research, what do we know today that we didn't know even, say, 20 years ago?
There was a point that finally Western intelligence groups came to the conclusion that they cannot protect the Shah's government. They have to go to someone else. And the only thing they saw in the whole situation, that Iran had a very, very large, active leftist movement and 1,000 miles of border with then Soviet Union. The only choice they had was a Islamic movement, which they thought they would control the same way that British thought, they would control the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But I think we should go back. I think that's not about just the last few months. The reality is that after the beginning of modernity, from Iranian Revolution of 1905, and then the rule of Reza Shah and everything else, we had development of two societies in Iran. The modern society of the cities and the so-called non-modern society of the villages. And with the increased income of oil, there were more and more reason for people from villages to come to cities. And it became a situation that probably on the verge, maybe 2 years before Iranian Revolution, many cities in Iran had become villagized, had become more and more ideologically close to ideology of villagers who came to basically make more money, and they were religious. And Tehran, most of the mosques, never had anybody more than 50 parishioners, and suddenly 1,000, 2,000, all of that. We had a revolution of people from outside of cities against the cities. And really, the cities were taken over by zealots and believers in religion, and that's really what happened. Everybody was just completely surprised. How is it possible that a city like Tehran, with all these beautiful boulevards and stores and everything else, bunch of religious zealots are taking over?
But back to in terms of the connections and the enabling by the United States, say, of those formalist Islamists, that would be related to a strategic play related to the Soviet Union?
Yeah, of course. They looked at the Soviet Union as the enemy, and they played that. But the problem with the policy of the United States at the time was that the United States was completely different from the several hundred years of the colonial rulers of England. England would study every country completely. I mean, they would just go over every inch of that country in order to be able to control, and they did for many, many hundred years. United States basically, people sat in an office and analyzed, and many times never realized what's going on. Yes, the idea was to support any movement against the left and all of that in support of the, maybe they wouldn't call it Islamists, they thought this is just passing things. But to this day, I have to say, to this day, United States doesn't have complete understanding of what happens in Middle East, in cultural, tribal, religious, and everything in that regard. And they lose every time. The reality is that there was a chance, huge chance for the United States to align themselves with the democratic forces in Iran and calm down the situation. They did not. because it was a global issue. So yes, the United States definitely helped creation of the Islamic Republic without intention. This is not that they wanted to do this, but they had no choice. They thought Shah is gone. Who do we bring to power? And that's what they did, because every time it is like that, and I've always said that, in my speeches and researches, every time British Empire left a country, it was with a ceremony, with a flag, kind of brought down and respectfully left. And most of the time that unfortunately the United States left some of this country was either from a rooftop or absolutely in disgrace because of the lack of knowledge of the culture of these countries to this age.
At the center of all of this, back in 79, is General Robert Heiser's 79 mission to Tehran. And it's now widely known that Heiser met with senior Iranian military leaders without any clearance from the Shah and established meetings between them and Khomeini allies. Why didn't the Shah take any measures against Heiser?
Because he was afraid. Shah was not a very brave individual. He was not like his father. He basically thought that he is in a box, and this is a scripture they've given him to read. All the memoirs I read, interviews that I read from people that are very high in military, Shah never basically intervened. Shah was only interested in his cut, who he is he going to be there? Reza Shah wasn't like that. Reza Shah wanted everything, wanted control. I mean, you cannot be the half-baked dictator. Unless you're a dictator or not a dictator.
Right.
Shah was like, okay, whatever, I am there. And
this is what Abbas Milani says, to paraphrase him, that he wasn't a dictator enough to prevent the revolution.
No, this is Darish Humayun told me this, a group of people like Darish Humayun got around the Shah and recommended that he would go and kill, like 2,000 people, arrest 20,000 and stop the whole thing. And he wouldn't do that. And to be honest with you, that is to his credit. That if there is one credit to the Shah is that he did not do that. He did not go in killing people and killing the whole so-called revolution by bloodshed and all of that. And because of that, that's a good point in his life. But that was not in his character anyway. And people like Dariush told me before his death, a good friend, wonderful person, he come from different, from the opposition ideas, but he said, that there was recommendation was that go after the guys, kill, 2,000 people and arrest 20,000 people and put this whole thing to rest. And these people really believe that it's going to end it. And Shah did not fall for it. We can say it was because he was tarsu or not brave enough, or because that was not in his character, which is, in a sense, good.
Much of the narrative about the tumultuous final days of the Shah are based in two autobiographies, The Pride and the Fall by Sir Anthony Parsons, who served as the British ambassador to Iran at the time of the revolution, and Mission to Iran, of course, by William Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador to Iran at the time. So today, historians such as Andrew Scott Cooper, we just heard from, raising serious doubts about the accuracy and the motives behind these autobiographies. What is your take on Sullivan and Parson and their books?
Very much based on their personal interest. It's not accurate. We need to gather more information from people at the time to come up with a more correct evaluation of what happened in the last 2 years of the last monarchy, because we owe it to the history. This is a country. This is our longest train of kingdom in the world, and it ended in a sense that Nobody thought it would end like this. And I know a lot of people, or some people, think that it will come back, with Reza Pahlavi and all of that. Realistically, it would not go back. In no country it has come back. But I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about the reality of history. This has to be evaluated, and both of the books you mentioned have shortcomings in that respect. And in final analysis, in my opinion, Shah of Iran, who was a dictator, who actually put the most decent man of the modern time of Iran, Dr. Mossadegh, in jail, he was a reformer. He was a reformer. And he could have remained a reformer, and he would have remained despite all of these things as a reformer. He missed that chance. And so this is not a black and white evaluation. This is something that we have to evaluate. And the other last thing I have to say is that Shah was extremely suspicious of foreigners. He really thought many times, you see in the memoirs of Alam, Yadashtay Alam, that he says that these people brought my father to power and they took him out of the country, and they're going to do the same thing to me. He was extremely suspicious of that, and he was not powerful. To build a group of people around him that came from different backgrounds to fight that, and that feeling, the way he left the country on the tarmac crying. I was at the time a not Republican in the sense of American, but
right.
But when I saw the king of Iran crying like that, I felt ashamed for my country, for my people. It was like the Baymans that were forced on Iran to separate good portions of Iran from Iran. This was the king of Iran. And me and my father, as people that were absolutely for republic, seeing the king of Iran leave Iran in tears like that, to be honest with you, it broke my heart. Because that's my nation, and that guy, to that point, is my king.
A guy that you helped overthrow.
Yeah. But I didn't want him to leave like that.
You mentioned Mossadegh. And if you don't mind, let me ask you a couple of questions about 1953, because I know that's an area of your expertise. And Iranian intellectuals such as yourself have long argued that the revolution, in a sense, was inevitable, if long-standing, as a consequence of the 1953 coup. Just to push back on that, could it be that the coup was perhaps a defining factor only within the intellectual circles, many of whom were either nationalists or leftists? I mean, could the coup have had much less significance for the Iranian, the ordinary Iranian?
Yes, of course. I'm not one of those proponents of the idea that it was the coup that caused the Islamic Revolution. I don't believe in that at all. That was a terrible, terrible page in our history. It was the biggest mistake of the Shah, and I don't want to go into that. But the point is, it created a new chapter in Iran. The chapter that was opened in Iran after 1920, when the Allied forces invaded Iran, and there was some pseudo-democracy in Iran and elections and all of that, was that there could be political debate, and there was, and it was great. That ended in Bistashte Mordad, ended in the coup. Mm-hmm. Shah had a choice. He ended it. He consolidated power. He now could basically build a new society. To some extent he did. And then to some extent he actually went further. He actually created some other issues, other problems, and problems that exist in the countries of Middle East. So the issue of the coup of 1953 has to be examined separately from Iranian Revolution. I know some people like to link the two together and say that's the cause. It's not the cause. Absolutely, it's not the cause. Has nothing to do with each other. But yes, there is an issue that kind of democracy that has started in Iran after invasion of Iran by Allied forces, it ended in 1953, and nothing came back to it. And that is the biggest issue, that we never saw the signs of the constitutional revolution and the constitution, basically. Again, parliament became nothing, and Jin became, that's it, the ruler, which was the whole issue of the constitution to end. But that's the whole point, and there was a dialogue that was lost in the whole culture in the society from in the 1960s actually, I'm sorry, in Iran.
Just as a sidebar, the current regime, or the Islamist rulers of Tehran, let's say, they also rely heavily on the 1953 coup d'etat in their official accounts to delegitimize the Shah. This occurs to me as it's quite ironic, as they openly renounce the late Prime Minister Mossadegh and nationalists as well. So what is the root of this contradiction?
The root is basically a culture of anti-Americanism and anti-foreigner. That goes back to the middle of the 19th century Iran, from the Roqe contract, that Iranians actually rebelled against anything that was foreigner. And then after 1950, 1953, American became the enemy. They became the reason that Iran is the way it is. And the Shah became the symbol of the American control of Iran. And he was, as they call it, Nokara imperialist, Nokara Amrika, things like that. That was it.
Right.
That American imperialism has taken over Iran so much that we have privilege. Shah became the agent of imperialism, agent of the West. And the mullahs used that tremendously, in a sense, capably, which the leftists could not do that. And the whole thing was a lie. You know, Shah was not a servant of so-called imperialism. Yes, sure, he was aligned with the West. He was definitely aligned with the United States. But this whole concept that they told him what to do and he would do that, well, that was not true. But that wasn't an issue anymore. The issue was when the movement started, 2 years before Iranian Revolution, Shah was already agent of the United States. And U.S. was the reason that Iran was in this situation. To this day it is. To this day, U.S. the main enemy. And the Islamists actually use that, not just in Iran, in other countries too, masterfully. And the United States has not been able to respond to that. Realistically speaking, there were more friendliness between Iranians and Americans than animosity, but that was created and the government could not respond to that, and the opposition fell into that, and revolution fell into that. And realistically speaking, Iranian Revolution became an anti-imperialist, anti-American movement, and we lost it.
You know, I'm listening to you, and I'm cognizant of the fact that as lucid and logical and and somewhat passionate as everything you say is, that there are people listening in our Iranian community that are going to jump on every line and disagree with it. And I want you to, I put this to Abbas Milani and to Andrew Scott Cooper as well. If you can take off your historian hat for a second and just talk to me as a member of the diaspora like myself, and the fact that there is so much partisanship, there is so much factionalism, a lot of it based in real emotion and anger and heartbreak about this period and our collective history. That when somebody, I can, in your case, for example, I can hear somebody saying, well, he's the son of a prominent ally of Mossadegh, so that's him. He's influenced by his father's teachings as well, and all that. How do we mend this? How do we mend this instinct to jump into into different factions when it comes to assessing our own history?
I think we have to change the course or discourse. We can never unite on history. We're not supposed to. We cannot create a political movement, social movement, or any movement based on history, because history is history. And we're supposed to have different assessment of that. The Iranian intellectuals from all different backgrounds, they should start talking about the future. We have a country that at one time used to produce so much oil that was envy of every other country. We have a practically bankrupt country right now. We have an isolated country. We have very little relationship all over the world. So the point and the question among Iranian intellectuals, thinkers, people that are looking for the future of Iran is, how can we build this future? The issue is not Bistashta Mordad. The issue is not coup. The issue is not the analysis of what the Shah was, or Reza Shah was, or Mossadegh was. Those are extremely important as part of our heritage, as part of our history. But in building a new future, we have to start discussing how can we build Iran again.
Just returning to the precipitant for this conversation today, and for these conversations we've been having this week on the summer marking the 40th anniversary of the death of the Shah, if you can zoom out and going back to these narratives that played immediately, certainly before and after the revolution, about the Shah, about the Pahlavi dynasty, is it fair to say, Mohammad Amini, after 40 years, the record of the last Shah of Iran has been rehabilitated to a certain extent in Iran's national discourse and the discourse of the diaspora, or at least significantly altered?
Only because of the things that the Islamic Republic has done. Otherwise, it would not have been. What happened, and we should not forget this. There are a lot of good things that were done under Pahlavis, both father and son. But the issue is that we had in revolution, we had one of the greatest non-violent revolutions in the world. And we created one of the first parliaments in the world, outside of Europe. We passed laws. Democracy is not something that is built overnight. It takes time. I mean, you look at even the history of the United States or England, especially the United States. It came to a point that there was a civil war. 800,000 people died in that, and it took a lot of time. We were not given the chance of experimenting democracy and finding out how it works. And the most important part of the Iranian constitution was Majlis, the parliament. And Reza Shah called it a Tawile stable. And then Mohammad Shah, basically after 1953, the coup, just absolutely put it aside. And he ruled basically as a king. Did they do some good things? Oh, no question about it. So my point is, no, the judgment about the Pahlavi dynasty is not over. It has to be reevaluated. It has to be just. It has to be fair. It has to be balanced. And at the same time, it has to be judged against the possibilities of the time.
Right. Although, when you say any rehabilitation is based on what came after in terms of the Islamic regime, which many people now look at with disdain and despair, isn't that the point? I mean, isn't that people look back at their history and say, oh, we didn't realize what we had had? In fact, you hear some of this discourse in the United States now, where there's an upcoming election and people will say they are reevaluating the Bush years now because of what we've had with Trump. I was an activist against Bush, but it is reframed now. And so this is the way we see the past, isn't it? Through the lens of what we are experiencing today?
In a very short time, yes. Yes. When you're looking at it in a very short time, yes. But when you are going to build a society for the future, no. You have to look at possibilities. I mean, when you look at the past against another past, and you say that this was the past and this was the other past, and which the other past was better than this past, then you are you're subjecting yourself to a limit. But societies are progressing. You don't have to do that. We are a proud nation with amazing underground and social geographic possibilities. So many different cultures. Why should we limit ourselves between the choice of this government and the last one? Why can't we say, why don't we build something new? You can use the same thing about this regime. You can look at this regime and say, they built 600 universities. They took, they brought gas to every village, electricity, all of that. But, they did this or that. The point is, our societies doomed to be within possibilities of the past and the past. Or they can look forward. I think we can look forward. We did it during Mashrute, during Mossadegh. We need to look forward. We need to look at possibilities that are real, that we as a nation, as people, with this history, with this culture, with this kind of abilities, so many intellectuals all over the world, we can build something a lot better than this society that we're living in the past.
So on that note, a final question, and you did allude to this earlier in the interview, but let me ask it directly. In recent protests in Iran, I'm thinking about last November, especially in those bloody protests, right. we saw what seemed like a growing chorus of chants in the streets calling for the return of the monarchy. From the historic point of view, could a constitutional monarchy be some kind of natural successor to a theocratic dictatorship?
Without any bias, I don't think so. It hasn't ever happened. It has not happened in other parts of the world. And the problem is that we don't have the model in Iran. We don't have a period in Iran that the constitution, the monarchy was abiding by the constitution, except during Ahmad Shah, which everybody called him such a weak, king, and promoted Reza Shah. I don't think so. And the bigger question I have is, why do we need it? I mean, is this a situation that our country needs a king to put the different parts of the society together? I mean, during this Islamic Republic, has any part of the country has separated? I don't think so. I don't think if you can prove to me that a kingdom would be a good way of keeping the country together, I won't have any problem with it. But I don't see any reason for it. I don't see any justification for it. I think Reza Pahlavi could come back and live in one of the castles and be a money-making, king in Iran without any authorities. But in reality, thinking that's going to be a salvage, I don't think so. Let me add something to it that may be a little bit, too much. I don't think Reza Pahlavi has any desire to go back to Iran. I don't think he knew. I think he knows that there is no room for him. So the fact that Iran could go back to a constitutional monarchy, my question is why, and how, and who.
Mohammad Amini, I'm so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for participating in this series. Thank you for your patience, and I know you haven't been feeling so great, so it's an extra gratitude that you.
Thank you very much.
Very well to have you. Merci. Khodafis. That is historian and author of The Time and Life of Ahmad Kasravi, Mohammad Amini. He joined us from Orange County, California today. This is Full Time for Roqe today. Thank you to all of those who have been supporting us, subscribing, spreading the word. Thank you. Thank you to Mo Rahimian and Inshufen for your support of this episode of Roqe. You can reach us on all various platforms, including Telegram now. See you on Monday with Homas Ashar as my guest. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashi.